Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Camie Morris. She'll be our first presenter.
Thank you, Dean Gormley, and many thanks to Dr. Travis Nelson for putting together this important forum on race and policing. I am really grateful to be part of this discussion with my talk, Important Historical Developments in Policing, Implications for Police Legitimacy Among Black Americans. So as most of you know, when a video surfaced on social media of George Floyd being killed by Minneapolis police officers, communities throughout our nation erupted into demonstrations and protests against police brutality and systemic racism. Not long after that, results of a Gallup poll were released and showed that the public's confidence in police fell below 50% for the first time in the nearly 30-year history of asking this survey question, as you can see here in 2020. Perhaps even more troubling are the massive racial gaps that exist in the results. So the results suggest that 56% of white adults reported having a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in police versus only 19% of Black adults. Well, let's talk about confidence in police. Why do we need to know about it? It's a broad measure of the public's support for the police as an institution, and it's essential to the popular assessment of police legitimacy. And it appears that we have, that the institution of policing in the United States is having a legitimacy crisis, particularly among African Americans. And just as a reminder of the importance of police legitimacy, I want to note that in settings where the legitimacy of the police is limited, policing takes on more arbitrary and violent forms. On the other hand, when it's considered legitimate, the police can rely on the authority of their office and less on coercive force to secure obedience. So we know it's important. Well, what can we do? In order to fix the legitimacy crisis faced by the institution of policing, we must first look at the history of policing in our country, especially as it pertains to Black Americans, and learn the lessons of our troubled past. So let's begin with a brief overview of that history. So the first traces of policing in America developed during its colonial period. It was characterized by the watch in the North and slave patrols in the South. And despite their many differences, initially both were created to regulate social disorder and the behavior of minorities, as we'll come to see. So the standard history of American police development really focuses on the northern colonies and their development of concepts which they borrowed from England, like the night watch, the constable, and the sheriff. The watch system was an informal attempt at keeping settlements safe from fires, crime, and disorder by having watchmen walk the streets at night and eventually during the day, and to look for trouble and alert the community if problems arose. Okay. But upon closer examination, historical documents point to the development of watches as a response to the desire among northern colonies to protect their communities from the dangers of Native Americans and to control the behavior of Blacks. I listed some examples here to support that view. And the first one is that the night watch in colonial America was instituted in Boston during the 1630s because of fear of attacks by Native Americans. In Boston in 1740, the law stated that the watch were to look out for disorderly Blacks and Indians. And in Boston in 1769, the watch were ordered to arrest all Blacks found after dark without a lantern. And while we know that slavery was obviously much more prevalent in the South Slaves still had to follow strict slave laws in the North. And in New York, the slave codes were as harsh as those in the South. In 1705, in the city of Albany, one particularly harsh example, a law stated that to prevent their running away, all slaves of that county found traveling alone 40 miles above the city or upon conviction to be put to death. As I mentioned, the history of the development of law enforcement, often presented by scholars, historians, and police practitioners, focus on the development of policing from the Northern perspective. The lesser known slave patrols, though, much more closely resemble our current or modern day law enforcement departments. In colonial times, it was believed that slaves were a dangerous class. They could run away, commit crimes, or revolt as a group, which was an especially terrifying prospect for whites in colonies where Black slaves numerically outnumbered them. Each slave state created laws that controlled slaves. These were called slave codes, and then they established slave patrols to enforce these codes. The first slave patrol developed in the colony of Carolina in 1704. Slave patrols were armed. They patrolled at night by foot or horseback, stopping Black people, searching their homes, chasing, capturing, and returning runaway slaves to their owners. They were also notorious for being brutal and ruthless in controlling the slave population. The actions of such patrols established an indelible impression on both the whites who implemented the system and the Blacks who were the brunt of it. Okay. So in Charleston, South Carolina, by 1837, that department, or the slave patrol, had about 100 officers working for it. That was far more than any other city department in the North. Policing expert and historian Dr. Sam Walker, along with former New York Police Department Commissioner Murphy and former Police Foundation Director Williams, along with various other scholars and historians, agree that there's a strong argument to be made that the first American modern style policing occurred in these slave patrols. So slave patrols functioned throughout the Civil War. And when slavery was abolished in 1865 with the passing of the 13th Amendment, new police departments emerged in place of the existing slave patrols. It's been said that that transition was seamless, and that's because these new departments, while they weren't enforcing slavery, they were spending their time enforcing Black codes and then eventually Jim Crow laws. While some think slave patrols were the first modern departments, others argue that the new city department in the North marked the beginning of modern policing. So let's take a look at that. In the North, the formal watch groups, constables, and sheriffs were not capable of dealing with the intensifying social conflict and rioting resulting from problems with immigration, urbanization, and industrialization that were occurring in the early 1800s. In the middle of the 1800s, the watch system evolved into modern, which means sort of public and permanent municipal police departments. The Boston Police Department was the first example of this in 1838, and then many soon followed. Under either circumstance, modern police departments developed out of a concern with controlling dangerous classes, such as slaves, free Blacks, and immigrants, and maintaining the status quo, rather than out of a concern with crime control per se. From the beginning of their modernization in the mid to late 1800s to the present day, major reforms in the institution of policing have occurred in the United States. Despite these changes, conflicts between Blacks and police continued across the nation throughout the century. And during the Civil Rights Movement, the tensions escalated and exploded in a surge of riots between 1964 and 1968. Speaking in the aftermath of one of these riots, which took place in 1965 in Watts, a part of Los Angeles, Senator Robert Kennedy stated that there's no point in telling Blacks to observe the law. It has almost always been used against them. In fact, inner cities were impoverished and drained of economic opportunities, and legislative successes at the federal level with Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were not reflected in the daily lives of African Americans facing things like police conduct, misconduct, economic inequality, segregated housing, and inferior educations. Sort of as a result of these riots in 1967, President Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission, which was made up of political moderates, interestingly, to investigate the causes of race riots. And in fact, much to his disappointment, their commission found that the deep hostility between police and ghetto communities was a primary cause of the disorder. Institutional racism and poverty were causing inner city violence. So the commission came out and made several recommendations related to officer conduct. So they said officers need to conduct themselves properly in their routine duties, eliminate abrasive practices, but also they made a recommendation that substantial government funding should be directed towards social reform and alleviating poverty. Many departments made progressive changes to policing because of the report's findings. It was very well known. Departments did things that were very positive, like hiring more Black officers and other minority officers, creating policies to regulate police use of force and the use of community policing. However, this 2018 Smithsonian Magazine article entitled "The 1968 Kerner Commission Got It Right, but Nobody Listened," argued that the recommendations of the commission were never fully realized, especially with the funding portion of funding social programs that would help alleviate poverty. The same year the commission released its recommendations, Richard Nixon won the presidential election, and he ran on a law and order campaign. He called both in his campaign, but also in his presidency, for military-style arming of police, cracking down on inner city crime, and then eventually declared a war on drugs in 1971, stating that drug abuse was public enemy number one. The impact of the war on drugs and the militaristic approach to combating it was disproportionately harmful to Black Americans and their confidence in the police, the legacy of which continues today, unfortunately. So what can we say, what can we learn from some of these lessons of the past? Well, when the government criminalizes social problems like drug addiction, mental health, and poverty, the problems tend to worsen. When we rely mainly on police to solve all of our social problems, the problems worsen for everyone, right? The communities and the police. And it leads to the further erosion of confidence in police, especially among Black Americans. And the legitimacy of police is then called into question. And that's all I have for tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Morris. I appreciate it. Next is Dr. Stacy Strobel. And just a quick reminder before you get started, please remember to put your questions in the chat. And Stacy, I think you're muted. There you go.
It was good I was muted because I was going to talk over you, which is
sorry. No. I'm still learning that.
No, it's the bane of being on Zoom. So hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. That was excellent, Camie. I normally study, those of you who have had classes with me or know me, I normally study police and minority relations comparatively in other countries. I don't usually talk about the United States. And so this presentation was a really great opportunity for me to reflect on my own country and some of my own experience in law enforcement in a previous life when I was a probation officer in New York, and to sort of think about how America, where America is at this particular moment. And my mentor, Dr. Maki Haberfeld, who is a very renowned police scholar, used to always say that democracy is hard on policing and policing is hard on democracy. And what she meant by this was that any of the social schisms that are apparent in a society, that's going to crop up in policing, that police are no different from the public. They come from the public. They are among the public. And if you remember the famous quote from Sir Robert Peel, for those who know their police history, the police are the public and the public are the police. But I'm going to argue today that this sort of somewhat normal, and I'm not excusing it, but sort of the normal struggle that minorities have in national contexts around policing and justice, it's exacerbated here in the United States. It is more intense. And there's, as I'm going to show later in the presentation, there's international concern that we are not the beacon around the world when it comes to policing, even though we like to think of ourselves as part of our American socialization. If you were educated here, we often think of ourselves as great leaders in democratic administration and democratic structures. And in fact, on this one, we aren't that. And so I'm going to share my screen. And I just have a few slides, and I'm going to probably spend most of the time on the first couple ones. Let's see. And so those of you who have taken Intro to CJ, you've heard of the blue wall of silence, also known as the blue curtain, which is the general notion that cops don't rat out other cops. And when we think about policing, we think about an occupational culture where there's danger and there's a need for solidarity in order to get the job done and for police to have each other's backs. But as many police scholars from the mid 20th century on have talked about, is that solidarity has a dark side. And that dark side potentially is the reluctance to police themselves in terms of reporting misconduct, reporting corruption, and that this is caught up in masculine notions of who we protect, who we're protecting people from, and who are the protectors. And I would argue that, and Camie did a great job of presenting the history, what I'm so thankful for that coming before mine, because we can see that race is caught up in policing, that we start out, the earliest organized policing in our southern states were slave patrols, and that's significant. There is an institutional line between slavery and policing. Now, how that line is drawn is controversial and difficult, and talking about culture is very, very difficult. One of the main and most influential articles on this came out in the late 1990s, Janet Chan's Changing Police Culture. And what she argued was that we have in our society the context of this unresolved racial tension and this unresolved history of white male protectors with badges under the color of law being very, very difficult on Black communities. And that has not been fully dealt with and continues to be a source of tension today, and that becomes the context for police minority relations, that you have multi-generational trauma around policing, you have communities that feel unfairly targeted for police operations, the use of excessive force and so on, and that this potentially sets up a reaction and a sort of cycle of an us versus them. And so we have the professional culture of policing around solidarity and danger. And I'm going to argue that we also have subcultures within policing that maintain and allow for certain racist attitudes as a trope or as a theme that is caught up in issues of masculinity, caught up in issues of solidarity. And that whereas many police officers and perhaps most would abhor these things, there are broken accountability systems. And so in many other professions where certain attitudes and behaviors would be rooted out, we haven't seen that in policing. Policing has managed to police itself, but with this blue wall of silence and this blue curtain, whichever metaphor you want to use. Unfortunately, even though we're in 2020, there are some very serious pockets of police corruption and police racial attitudes that exist to this day. Now, I'm going to be making some broad generalizations about the kinds of attitudes that happen within police culture. But again, I want to be careful to say that these are generalizations and it's uneven. There are examples of more enlightened policing in certain places and certain times. And I'm actually going to focus on the darker side or the more negative aspects on purpose, sort of to make my point. And I think that when I first started as a probation officer, I, as a white female, I had a couple situations where racist jokes and racist language was used in such a way as if to share a common bond with me, assuming that because I was white, I would understand and want to engage in denigrating entire neighborhoods of people based on ethnic or racial identity. And I reflected on this. I can't say I was a big hero. I didn't go along with it. I stayed away from these folks, but I didn't necessarily change it either. But the point is that it is not uncommon for people, when you go into these organizations, for you to actually be tested out as to sort of where you stand on these issues and whether you are willing to go along with a racialized notion of policing, because it somehow is embedded also in the masculinity, in the sexism, and in all the other things. And that's somehow what we have over the years in US policing. Perhaps it's the sheriff on the Western frontier, and what we've inherited from that. But there's this notion that that in order to be bonded together, we need to have some kind of enemy, and we need to be tough on somebody, and that increases our comfort with each other. And anthropologists call this kind of sort of negative bonding, if you will, cultural intimacy. And I do think that there are subcultures of policing that are very culturally intimate around being really tough on Black people. And trying to potentially place all sorts of problems of law and disorder onto a certain group of people by virtue of this racist past. But they know that it's abhorrent to outsiders. So Michael Hertzfeld, the anthropologist who came up with cultural intimacy, said that it's precisely because it's controversial and abhorrent that it can be a form of solidarity between officers, that actually that intimate denigration becomes part of the bond. And so my point here is just that I think when you are inside some of these agencies, that you can find pockets of this. And it has to do with a lot of different things. And the question is, do officers bring racist attitudes to the force, or do they acquire them along the way? I've been reflecting on this. Karen Terry did some really great work on pedophile priests in the Catholic Church. And she said, you know, it's not, most priests weren't pedophiles, but it became known that if you happen to be a pedophile, you could exist in the Catholic Church without anyone calling you out on it. Right? There was a space there for you. And even though it wasn't even most priests, there wasn't an accountability mechanism, and that got known. And so I sometimes think that because of the lack of accountability, police officers so rarely get criminally prosecuted. The only way to truly get justice in a lot of these police encounters that go wrong is the civil courts. And of course, you have to have money or a high profile incident and get some pro bono work to get to sue people. It's very hard to sue. Section 1983 for the average person. But the point here is, I do wonder if this is a profession where it's been considered okay, because nobody's going to call you out, because once you're in the blue wall, you can kind of carve out a space where your discourse, which is potentially difficult on people by way of race, and it could also be any other difference, but I think race is the one that particularly resonates in American life and in American social relations, that this is a place where you could potentially hide out. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, that is this such a occupation? And I think that what happens with policing is whether people come to the job with attitudes or they learn them along the way, it often gets reinforced through the social isolation and the stress of the job. People can reinforce some of these negative racist attitudes just by the kinds of, not only the discourse around them or what people will say around them that isn't called out, but also by sort of sensing and having a really skewed reality of what the world is like at a certain point. If the only time you ever interact with Black people is when you're arresting them or you're investigating or doing any of these police acts, you're going to begin to reinforce notions of difference and potentially feeling very critical of folks. And so that can simply fold in on itself. A lot of folks, and so where do we get some of these ideas about police culture? So over the years, scholars have embedded themselves. Some have been police, former police going into police organizations, or it's been researchers that have gotten permission. But when you get into sort of the deep ethnography and you really talk to police about what it's like to be on the job, what kind of attitudes are there, and how difficult it is to do the right thing, how ambiguous situations are, and how socially isolating it is, you begin to recognize that there's a whole lot of symbolic interaction that is going on. Things that are happening deep below the surface that are really difficult to talk about. And so, you know, Dr. Gelada talked about this in our first meeting for race and criminal justice, this notion that we absorb, often unconsciously, the stereotypes of who is a criminal and who is an officer. And Black men and the control of Black men's body and Black men being the threat goes all the way back, as Dr. Morris said, to our early history. And once we have this acting as a lens over a police job, we begin to get a symbolic assailant, the Black man, and we see danger by virtue of that race, okay? It's, you know, usually unconscious. We've all grown up with the television and the movies and the attitudes that we've grown up with. It's exacerbated, as I've said, by subculture within some of these agencies, not all. But we begin to see danger in race alone. And not in the other factors that we normally would want to consider in police public encounters. And so this is why I think that some situations that may start out, some police public encounters that start out reasonable take a turn. And at the end of the day, we have a dead Black person. And so part of this has to do with this potential cultural piece that people are operating in ways, police officers are operating on emotional levels that they're not even aware of when it comes to race. And Eric Garner is a great example of this. The guy was selling loose cigarettes and avoiding taxes and doing a small illegal activity, and he ends up dead from a chokehold that should not have been applied. And how did this go in this direction? Was this even necessary given the lack of seriousness of this crime? This person was over-policed and he ended up dead. And he was over-policed potentially because he was a Black male. When we add in, if we were to replace him with a young white person, we may have gotten a completely different outcome here. Both would have started the encounter potentially, but where the encounter goes has everything to do with how the police officer senses danger and how much authority they think they want to have in a situation. And that often has racial overtones. Because again, I think there's a tradition unspoken in our country that white men protect us from Black men. And from other dangerous minorities. Whether we want to admit that or not, our culture often operates out like that underneath the surface. And the reason that this is so problematic is that our laws are not helping us sort through this in a way that can hold anyone criminally responsible for acting in these ways, nor can it really address any of the kinds of training or recruitment or any of the solutions that we may need, because we still have the so-called lawful but awful standard, Graham v. Conner, where all the police officer has to do when he's used his discretion is to articulate that he or she, as the officer, had a fear of the subject. And so we don't get an indictment by a grand jury in the Eric Garner case because the police were able to argue that there was a fear when Garner began to resist his arrest. And it's not the normal reasonable person that our laws usually have, but it's a reasonable officer, which even more insulates the standard within the culture of policing, it's a reasonable officer. But again, we have the blue wall of silence, the blue curtain. Officers understand other officers, they have each other's backs. It's not clear to me that that anything would be particularly unreasonable to an officer unless it was entirely extreme. And so I think this is some of the reason why, you know, people watching videos of encounters that go bad, it seems so obvious to them because maybe they're acting as a reasonable person when in fact the standard is something different. It is the alleged reasonable officer. And this standard does not directly take into consideration any of the subject's rights. It has to do with the police perception of the encounter, but not the subject's perception of the encounter. And so that is very, very problematic because there's no attempt to subjectively understand the experience of being policed. It's only from the point of view of who is doing the policing. And so it actually allows for a wide latitude of outcomes that are really hard on human life. And most other countries most other democratic countries have a sanctity of life standard. And so they are not interested in whether the officer feel fear as the primary thing, but whether the officer instead took all measures to protect life, which is a very different analysis of a situation. And so I wanted to end here. This is serious stuff and we need to solve it because the United Nations has us on the list of very problematic countries when it comes to policing. In July of this year, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution, and the intent originally when the resolution was discussed was to actually send a message to the United States that you have a crisis in policing. There's systemic racism in policing in the United States, and it needs to be addressed. Instead, what happened, because the US is such a powerful country within the UN, they were able to sort of take the US out of it and turn it into a more general, you know, countries where there are African people or people of African descent as minorities, those countries, plural, need to get on board with taking steps to deal with this systemic racism. And what I'm arguing, and I wish I had more time, I don't, I'm gonna end soon, I promise, because it's difficult to make cultural arguments in almost no time, but what I'm basically arguing here is we don't have a lack of rule of law in this country. We have plenty of law. And in fact, our law is allegedly race neutral. Where we mention race, we hope to do so, we protectively. But in fact, what I'm arguing is that we have agencies with authority for the use of lethal force that have not done the kind of self-scrutiny and haven't policed the kinds of attitudes and the kinds of narratives and the kinds of behaviors that have gone on in policing over generations. And that until we come to terms with that, we can't begin to solve this. And so on my final slide, I have a series of solutions, which I am not going to go into, though I do think overturning Graham v. Conner would be a really great place to start. But we need to get creative. The defund the police movement, I think, is potentially provocative. I think we need police in society, of course, but what do they have to say about how we could be using resources better to help people and to focus on human life and to fix race relations and not exacerbate the problem through over-policing folks and increasing intergenerational trauma and just keeping this cycle going. And so in the question section, I'm happy to take any questions on solutions if people want to talk more about solutions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Strobel. That was really informative and helpful, and definitely, you know, helps us connect with some bigger issues, and do have some great questions in the Q&A chat. So please keep them coming. I am making note of them all, and we have a couple more presenters, and then we'll be able to get to some questions. Next up is Dr. Rosalyn Broussard, Professor Emeritus from social sciences more broadly, but she is a political scientist. Look forward to hearing her presentation.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me back. It's glad to be back, even though it felt like I have not even went anywhere. A little bit about me. I'm a child of the South, grew up in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. And what I'm going to be looking at today is violence in America, because somehow or another we are under this impression that Black people in America are very violent. They're going to be running through the white neighborhoods, causing mayhem, which is not true. So we're going to look at the history of violence in America. So my agenda for the night is to look at violence in America, how violence is defined, and who is labeled violent and who is not labeled violent, the sanction and celebration of violence in America, the three types of racism, the physical and social destruction of Black bodies, and last, the impact that this destruction has on Black people in America today. So when we think about the three types of racism, I want to start here because according to Ian Lopez, there's hate, there's structural racism, and there's implicit bias. And hate, we all know an example of that. That would be the KKK. Structural racism, government institutions, but we're talking about de jure by law. So for instance, we had segregation in the early, since the Civil War to the early 1960s. De facto would be customs, not so much by law, but by customs, people are segregated. Implicit bias, and that is the one that he would say is the worst type of racism, which he called common sense racism, because he says it's racism without races. For instance, and I cannot even remember the lady's name right now, but she made this comment to say she has a Black son that she adopted, and the police would be well in their right to stop this Black child because Black people are more likely to commit more violence. And so that becomes a big problem. She would say, well, I'm not really racist. How could I be racist when I have adopted a Black child? But then in the back of her mind, it's common sense what she said, because she believed that Black people commit more violence. Another example would be Megyn Kelly, when she made the comment about Santa Claus was white and so was Jesus. Well, you know, Santa Claus is a fictional character, doesn't matter. But her argument was, well, we don't want to confuse the children. Well, exactly what children were you talking about? Because the only children you could have been talking about was white children, not Black children. And we know that Jesus is not white because he was born in the Middle East. But however, been adopted and European, then that's make common sense that we would see Jesus as white. So we start to look at American policies and Native Americans, the Indian Removal Act, boarding schools. And remember, these boarding schools started in the 1860s and they lasted until 1978. So if you're thinking about this, you're tearing children from a culture. This is a very violent act. The violence that was committed against these children, you know, they wasn't able to speak their language. If caught speaking their language, they could lose a digit on their finger. They could be beat violently, but all of this was sanctioned because what was America trying to do at the time? You know, manifest destiny, the white way, kill the Indian, save the man, Indian Removal Act, you know, very, very violent when you're talking about moving people from one place to another. Then we embrace that violence. Christopher Columbus is just an example that I have here, but think about all the other statues that we have around this country that celebrated violence against Black, brown, and red people, and that we still have a number of those statues today. Now, we think about slavery and violence. You're talking about keeping people in bondage here. And in order to keep these people in bondage, you can only do it through violence. So if you look at the first picture here, when it's a slave ship, and when you see all of these people being jammed in together, meaning, for instance, if you needed to have 300 people to sell, well, you were going to put 400 and pack them in together. Think about how you you take a person's humanity away. Think about a young woman who's on one of these ships. She's stripped naked. She's chained to another person, and they're chained for days on end. So you think about this young woman lying in her feces, her urine, sleeping where she's menstruating at. Think about that very violent act. Then if we look at the buying and selling of slaves once they got to America, once again, you're branding them like they are not people. Once again, they are not human beings. So think about the psychic that this sets in the white person's mind when you're thinking about people of color. So these people had no rights. They could be murdered. They could be raped. They could be beat. Amputation was also a part of this. So we have all of these things going on. Then we get the labeling of Black bodies, which brings me to the case of how we define violence in this country and who do we label as violence. So we look at our history on slavery. Black people were chattel, they were considered to be non-human, they were childlike, so therefore slavery protected them. But then after slavery, they became violent, being labeled as violent. Black males and the protection of white womanhood. So therefore we get a system where it becomes okay to arrest people of color, it becomes okay to continue killing people of color, because now they have this label as being violent. And unfortunately, that label still remains today when we're talking about Black men. If we think about, for instance, the angry Black man or the angry Black woman, it's like, well, why can't I be angry if I'm angry? Because that is not a human emotion. That is a human emotion. And it's because, we have common sense racism where a lot of people don't attach that to Black people. White men can be angry. They have a lot to be angry about, but that same thing is not given to Black America. So this was just kind of the labor, how the state government can just make any type of laws, round people up, arrest them, because number one, you had lost your labor force, so therefore you can just arrest Black people. It was kind of called another form of slavery. And remember, this started after Reconstruction and until the 1940s. And then here, once again, we have this modern day example of a chain gang. Now, what does this do in people's mind? We talk about common sense racism. If you happen to constantly see Black people being arrested, Black people as part of a chain gang, then in your mind, you're beginning to think, well, Black people commit a lot of crime. When I was a kid growing up in the South, whenever a Black person committed a crime, they would make mention of the person's race. And so even little Black kids begin to think, my God, we commit a lot of crime. So we look at white violence in the Black body. Violence becomes justified here. And so therefore, this killing of this man is okay because it's justified. I mean, you look at this, you look at the faces of these kids while a human being is being murdered, but it's justified. Once again, we look at the other picture, and this is in 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas. This particular guy is a journalist. And however, he was being attacked by a mob of white people, but it's justified because you have Black children trying to integrate this white school, which is a white space, and white America is protecting their space. Just Emmett Till accused of whistling at a white woman, 14 years old, and was murdered in 1955 in Mississippi. So now we go to defining protest in America. You know, who gets to protest? And who does not get to protest? So we look at sanctioned protests. So here we have a picture of the KKK, Edmund Pettus Bridge, and this was in the 1950s or early 1960s, mid 1960s, and perfectly fine. Here on the other side, we have a group of people that is not sanctioned. These are a group of people who are marching to Montgomery, Alabama, to ask for voting rights. And you see them, and then what you see the police officers, all white at the bottom, you know, waiting to stop them. And you're gonna see the next slide. This is what happened. So we get violence against these marchers who are marching for civil rights, human rights, the ability to be able to vote. And it's sanctioned because, hey, once again, this is not something that you deserve to have. KKK marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C., 1926. By all means, today it's a terrorist organization, but in 1926, it wasn't a terrorist organization. And I know a lot of time we look at the KKK and we think about poor white people. No, the KKK was a very organized organization. And it had the police department, people who belonged to the police. It had people from, that was in state government, local government, national government. As a matter of fact, in some southern states, it was not you would have maybe half of the police department might be members of the KKK. And so once again, who find legitimate protests? 1968 Olympics, you have Tommy Smith and you have John Carlos. At a time when you have Black people fighting for just to be safe in the country, for basic rights that they are entitled to. And because they were not getting this, they decided that they would protest and hold up a fist during the national anthem. And this cost them their medals. So the medals were stripped away. 2016, 48 years later, you have Colin Kaepernick protesting against police brutality. Once again, he pays dearly for this because it cost him his job, because it's not truly seen as legitimate protests. Recent 2020, so you have a Michigan state capitol on white men and standing up for their rights. As a lot of people would say, well, they were standing up for their rights. They wanted the governor to open up the state because they were losing money. So they were within their right to be able to do that. Even after some of these people were associated with this, would have been accused of trying to kidnap the governor. You know, still have people who can kind of justify some of their actions. California, 1970, Black Panther. Group of people also standing up for their rights. However, how are they labeled? Terrorists. Once again, defining violence, we have Tulsa, Oklahoma. People are familiar with that. Race riot in 1921, where you have this area called Black Wall Street that was totally burned to the ground. 36 people were killed. 24, I think, was Black, 13 were white. And once the National Guard showed up, well, what did they do? They arrested all of the Black people, put them in jail while white mobs looted and burned their businesses. Once again, legitimate. Why? Because somebody in that community had been falsely accused, we know now, of raping a white woman. Then Minneapolis Police Station, 2020. Well, why is it burning down? Well, a lot of people say, well, it was legitimate too, because, it burned down after the murder of George Floyd. But it depends upon how people see legitimate and non-legitimate. Nonviolence. So protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after the shooting of Jacob Blake. Then we have the other picture of Kyle Rittenhouse. He shoots 3 people, killing 2. And you even have the president saying, oh, he was fighting for his life. He would have been murdered. And then why was he even there? Because he came down or up or wherever to protect white property instead of being at home where he belonged. And so if we start to look at, for instance, this labeling of Black bodies, as being violent, and some of the impact of this. Here you have Trayvon Martin, kid, goes out to buy Skittles and a soda and never make it back home alive. Murdered by, I can't even think of my name right now, and I should have his name up there. But anyway, George Zimmerman. This goes to trial, and he's found not guilty because it was perfectly, once again, going back to common sense racism, for the jury to see that George Zimmerman was in fear of his life from Trayvon Martin, even though he was following Trayvon Martin. But that same jury could not see this the other way around, that maybe Trayvon was just as much in fear of his life, of George Zimmerman, especially since George Zimmerman was following him. But they couldn't see that because, once again, Trayvon, Black, must be up to no good, criminal.
Yeah.
Amon Avery. Alpha a stroll, decides to walk through property that many people have walked through to look at, who is then attacked by 3 white men who were not even arrested at first, and then decided, and was kind of surprised when they were arrested, because they were saying, well, we were making a citizen's arrest, because after all, Black man running, already labeled as criminal, he must have been up to no good. And I have one more example of this, and this took place in Wisconsin. You have a 15-year-old kid. Like many 15-year-old kids, he decides that he's gonna go into the store and get some alcohol. Now he can't buy it, so what does he do? He decides he's gonna put it in his backpack. Well, the store owner sees him putting it in his backpack, and he asks him for it, for the alcohol. Well, the kid is in such a hurry because he doesn't want to get caught. Book bag on his way out the door. And these 2 white guys grab him, put this kid in a chokehold, and murder this kid. And then they were surprised when they were arrested, because once again, they're there to protect the neighborhood. This kid was doing something wrong. He must have been a criminal. And so you have to ask yourself, now, I'm not saying that he should have been taking the alcohol. But how many kids have went into the store underage and stole alcohol? How many white kids have done that same thing and have not ended up dead? The problem here, when I think about the whole situation, we're talking about the police force right now, but the police department is part of the United States. And until we come to grips with our past history in this country, really look at it, investigate it, and then start to make some changes to turn things around, we're going to be here again and again and again. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Roz. Thank you very much. And we're getting some great questions, so this will be really helpful. We'd like to conclude tonight's presentations with Chief Michael Dalsing. So Chief Dalsing from the Chief of Police from the Dubuque Police Department. You're up next. Mark Dalsing, sorry. I apologize, Chief.
That's okay.
So welcome. The forum is yours.
Okay, I did go with the PowerPoint. I'm about PowerPointed out. I've been living on Zoom for the last 7 months and I can't handle any more PowerPoint. So I'm just going to do a little bit of talking tonight. I really don't like doing prepared conversations. I like just having off the cuff, but there's definitely some points I wanted to bring up tonight, and hopefully we'll get some good discussions about it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a short period of police history, more at the local level and where we are now. But I also want to talk about community involvement in the police process. But there's a couple of base topics I just want to bring up for conversation. I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years and have witnessed many of the highs and lows around policing, seen the trends that come and go, the latest, greatest products, everything else. But one thing that I've seen is things work in cycles, and we're in a cycle of awareness, and hopefully that we're going to see some good things come out of it. The one sure thing about policing is the people control what they want to see in their communities. And people constantly change their minds, and that's one of the things we see. They control it by their activism, letters to the editor, complaints to City Hall, and quite importantly, by electing people who support the same ideals, and they demand that their elected officials act to reflect those ideals. However, elected officials change every few years, and therefore so do the hot topics, and law enforcement's no different. Initiatives are pushed out to the federal level to address hot topics and trickle down to the states and counties and municipalities. Sometimes there's great ideas that work out, and sometimes they fail, and the failure isn't noticed immediately. One of the prime ones that is coming up in the current political conversations is the 1994 crime bill. On the positive end, the bill provided billions of dollars to put 100,000 new cops on the street to act in community policing models. Almost immediately, though, there was people that played with the system. So instead of an officer, you could buy equipment. So instead of doing an officer, they bought 3 squad cars so they could do the shifts like that. So that was one of the negatives that we saw. But again, whether it ever hit that 100,000 or wherever it hit, it put officers on the street and in the community policing model. On the negative side, the bill also put heavy penalties on criminal offenses, particularly on drug offenses and particularly on crack cocaine. The nation was in the throes of the crack cocaine epidemic at the time and the related violence. And the people that were impacted in those communities demanded that the government fix it. So part of that was a crime bill. The result was heavier penalties for crack sales. So selling 5 grams of crack cocaine would make you immediately eligible for federal prison. Selling the same amount of powder cocaine or heroin might not even get looked at the state court, or you might get some probation, parole type thing. You're definitely not going to go into the federal system. But if you had that 5 grams of crack, you're immediately eligible for the federal prison system. Just an idea, pretzel M&M is probably real close to what a knot of 5 grams of crack would look like. So one little piece like that could end somebody up in prison. And the people that were primarily impacted were people of color. The good intentions of lawmakers trying to, keep the peace in their communities and satisfy the communities, we saw in the long run how big of a negative impact that had on the communities of color. Even now, lawmakers are rushing to pass laws based on society's demands. There's some things out there. I don't know if Wisconsin's done anything officially yet, but in Iowa, they passed a law that said no chokeholds. Absolutely great. We had a policy about that, but they didn't go through the right process. They didn't solicit input. And they basically wrote a law that eliminated one piece of neck grabs, neck holds, but not another piece. So unless it impacts the airway, it's not a violation. So if you're doing a vascular hold, so cutting off the blood supply, you're still good, which is completely ass backward on how you want to be doing some of these things. So you're passing a law that doesn't have the impact that you intended because there was such a hurry to get it done. Secondly, I briefly want to talk about some of the realities about police use of force. A few years ago, I attended a community conversation on Islam, and one of the speakers used a great analogy that I use to this day to discuss a whole bunch of topics. The speaker noted that there's about 1.5 billion, billion with a B, Muslims in the world. And depending on your sources, there are a couple hundred radical Islamic terrorists. He said, just to be safe, let's say there's a full million radical terrorists. 1 million is a fraction of a percent of the total Muslims in the world. So why are we focusing so much time on that small fraction? And he threw up his hands and said, do the math. So that do the math mantra is one that I use quite often if it fits. So tonight, let's look at policing in that. Before I get into the data much further, let me state that any police involved death is tragic. And if it's under questionable circumstances, I fully support a thorough investigation and charges when appropriate. But keeping that in mind, there are usually around 1,000 people killed by police interactions each year around the country. And again, depending on what sources you look at, there's about 800,000 law enforcement officers in the country. So for argument's sake, if we say half are people like me in an administrative role that aren't working the streets, or they're working in the jails, or they're working in different positions where they're not actually out on the streets, we'll take off half of that. And then we'll just say half of the people are on their days off, vacation, sick leave. And just to account for other holes, we'll cut it in half again. So we're at 100,000 people, cops working any given day in the streets of America. Now that's a significant reduction from the potential 800,000 that we started with. Let's just say each of these officers handles just one call for service each day. That's 100,000 calls a day, 700,000 calls a week, 3 million calls a month, and 36 million calls a year. So 36 million calls a year. And do the math. The 1,000 deaths are barely a fraction of the police calls for service that they handle in any year. And again, I'm not trying to be provocative, and any one death that could be avoided is one too many. But when the majority of these cases involve armed people actively engaged in combat with the police, it changes things a little bit. We have to take the math into account, and it isn't the same as what the public narrative often suggests. Locally, I can show that my staff uses no force on 96% of its arrests. And historically, we've only had 3 officer-involved shootings in the past 35 years. We teach de-escalation techniques, do routine reviews of all arrest data, and see how our staff is performing, and have had a civilian oversight committee for 27 years. We're also an accredited agency which must follow the best practices to meet the accreditation standards. We place a high bar for ourselves, but we know there's always things we can do to improve. So as we look where we go next in policing, we have to look at where we're at now and what lessons have to be learned from the past. This can be done at the national level, but needs to be more appropriately reviewed at the local level. What is being done in Los Angeles won't necessarily work in Dubuque, Iowa, or Platteville, Wisconsin. We can, however, look around the country and see what is working or learn from other people's mistakes. After Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, one of the biggest lessons for the rest of the country as far as law enforcement was that you can't wait for a major incident to start planning. Asking the community to help you recover after an incident is too late. We also learned that the religious community has a greater reach into many communities than we previously thought. I always worked hard at trying to maintain positive relationships with the different segments in my community, but often they were individually and usually on project-specific programs. I decided that we needed to speak from a collective voice and create a team that could work towards equity, but also be able to help our city overcome a major incident if, God forbid, we ever had one. So I started by trying to identify every demographic in my community to include race, ethnicity, religion, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, among other identifiers, and then work closely with my partners in the Human Rights Department to assist me in finding points of contact within the communities. We realize that no one group represents all members of that demographic, so some groups have multiple representatives. Some groups are more recognizable, like on the national level, such as the NAACP, while others were newer group with only 3 members or just individual members within the community. Once we had our list, we had a meeting with representatives from all these communities, and at that meeting, we established the primary goals. Number 1, gain ideas on how we can all work together to ensure safety for all when individuals' cultures, beliefs, customs, and norms become targets of fringe elements wishing to create a further divide. 2, have a regular place to discuss what matters to the group regarding safety, getting to know each other, and about each other's culture and groups, and to seek assistance from our peers. And lastly, have a response group available for during adverse events, with the response group also playing a bridge role back to their home communities. So for the next 4 years, the Chiefs Forum, as we named ourselves, met as often as monthly to learn about each other, our roles in the community, and then training on multiple police topics, including use of force, defensive tactics, and even live shoot, don't shoot training scenarios. We then began to learn about the other roles within the government and what impact they had on the communities, and we brought in city staff from housing department, transportation, and other city initiatives. And prior to COVID shutting us down, we were working on the topic of how we can change the negative stereotypes about certain parts of the city being unsafe, and therefore stereotyping the residents of those parts of the city as being the problem. I'm hopeful that we can see COVID come under control so we can fire up the meetings again. One of the initial goals I previously mentioned was one I'd hoped we'd never have to use, and that was have a response group. Unfortunately, within the first month of the group's creation, we had to activate the group in response to a hate crime. Within 48 hours of the event, we held a press conference, and multiple members of the Chiefs Forum decried the hate crime and refused to allow it to represent our city. The exposure shifted the narrative away from the cowardly criminals that struck in the middle of the night, trying to bring attention to themselves, to the media showing how a community banded together to chase away hate. It isn't just formal groups like the Chiefs Forum that makes a difference, it's the long-standing positive relationships. When much of the country saw the rallies and marches over the last several months devolve into violence, our community saw peaceful rallies and marches. Some of this was because it wasn't officers in tactical gear, it was officers in shorts and polo shirts. It wasn't some unknown officer behind a helmet, but a familiar face that maybe helped them in a previous situation. It wasn't officers blocking marchers from going in certain directions, but officers blocking traffic so the marchers could move safely in the streets. It wasn't police planning how to quash future rallies, but sitting down with organizers to plan the next one. The last points I just want to bring up is a couple discussion topics and maybe some takeaways, and those of you at the academic level, maybe take back to your classrooms. And if we can answer this question, we'll answer this bigger topic of tonight's conversation. How do we fix society? As police, we have no choice but to respond to citizen complaints. The majority of our work is a result of citizen complaint. And we have neighbors with either overt or subconscious bias. The police become the manifestation of that backward thinking. In the opinion of many of the police, neighbor profiling is far worse than any police profiling. Dr. Strobel earlier brought up the Eric Garner case, and as one example of what I'm speaking about. I'd be willing to bet a paycheck that the officers at that scene really couldn't care less about Eric Garner selling loose cigarettes. But the neighborhood store owners did, and they complained to police supervisors and city management, or they made calls into the 911 center about the suspicious black man that was outside of their store or causing problems, whatever rationale they used to summon the police. So if you look at just about any of these tragic cases, they started with a citizen complaining about something, whether it was a legitimate concern or unconscious bias. The police ended up being the ones that had to deal with it. Another piece of police response for you to think about is that we will always support crime victims and respond to their calls for help. We have seen racial disparities in our arrests, and we acknowledge them. There's no doubt that we have seen our numbers are higher than our portion of the population, but we see nearly identical levels of disparity in our crime victims. So we have to take our victims' rights into consideration as well and make sure that they are being handled properly. It isn't just a city issue, and it isn't just a policing issue. The community is speaking and we're listening. They've advised they also have needs around the topics of equity in housing, education, employment, and many other basic needs. While we certainly can't control all these things, and some are done at the state level, state and federal level, we can certainly be the conduit to make sure the message is delivered. So thank you for the invitation tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to speak as a UWP alum. I always enjoy working with the college. So we'll turn it back over to our organizers, and I look forward to the questions that we're going to be hearing.
Wonderful, Chief. Thank you very much. Yes, we've got a number of questions. Please feel free. We have a good set of questions that I will try to curate, as Dr. Nelson indicated to me, but feel free to keep them coming. Absolutely. So can the panel speak to questions concerning the Kerner Commission? When the commission stated the call for governmental spending to minimize poverty, which in return would lower crime, what community resources were products of this spending?
I can speak a little bit to that. It's a good question. The reality is that the funding was never fully appropriated to the social programs. So in terms of like, was there any funding that was given to those programs to alleviate poverty? Maybe some, but the majority of the funding had gone towards that year anyways, that the year that the Kerner Commission made their recommendations to things other than social programs.
Okay, awesome, helpful. Is there any other comments, I'm sorry, before I move on from any of the other panelists? In regards to that, because I think, you know, in talking about governmental spending, a number of our questions, and I'm going to try and collect them here, a number of questions have revolved around this concept of defunding the police. And so the idea of defunding the police has been defined or framed as provocative. But when we talk about defunding the police, are we talking about taking away from police budgets to use it towards more necessary social things? And so we've had a number of questions that would ask the panelists, what do we think about defunding the police? Stacy, some of the questions were pointed to your comments about that within your presentation. So do you want to start there?
Sure. My understanding of the defunding the police, at least the discourse coming out of Black Lives Matter, isn't necessarily to eradicate policing or public safety function, but to think about what the money is being used for, and to the extent. So I think we have an interesting issue. The community policing era, which started in the 1980s, really created a situation by which we saw it as a public good, and we can debate whether it is or isn't, that policing organizations began to also be the social service organizations that were losing ground in other areas. And so police have been, the role of a police officer has expanded just infinitesimally into all sorts of social functions. They're mentors, they're coaches, they're educators. They hook people up with social services. They're doing all these things. And so for me, defunding the police, I would want to see, is that the appropriate use of police? Do we need somebody when we have a noise complaint from a neighbor, do we really need an armed response? Because if you call the police officer, that person will be armed. And so I think for me, the point of the defund the police is to really take a hard look at what we're asking the police to do, and can we better tailor our responses so that we don't make them more dangerous by virtue of how we're deploying our officers. And to do that, we may need to sort of take some money out of police budgets and put them into social services or into, I'm for reimagining it. Is there a middle ground where there's responding to certain kinds of complaints with a whole different kind of force that are more like peace officers? I think that's something that we could really consider as a society. And so that's what it means to me. And so I'd really like to see creative thinking on this. I'd really like to see community thinking on this. I think the people that should be most consulted, particularly when we're talking about police community relations, are minority communities that are dissatisfied, that in Camie's presentation did not have high levels of confidence in police. That's the first people you want to go to for what they want, and reimagine it. It doesn't need to be the way it's always been. And so that's what defunding the police means to me.
Any other panelists want to weigh in? Or
Yeah, when I think about defunding the police, sometimes I think that that was kind of the wrong word to use. And I feel like Stacy, we need to define what is the police job, because I think nowadays we're asking the police like teachers to do too much, you know. So we need to figure out what is that the police should be doing. Should they be dealing with mental health when maybe they are not capable of doing that? I've sat on the Police and Fire Commission here in Platteville for 5 years, and I'm not in favor of taking money away from the police, because when budgets were cut, then we had to move from hiring people with a 4-year degree to a 2-year degree. And I would argue that if you're going to be a police, that you need to have a 4-year degree. And we need to be able to pay people if we want those people to have that 4-year degree.
Camie, Chief, I'm putting everybody on the spot here.
I'll jump in quick, and I'll go along with what Rosalyn said, and Stacy. You know, I think the word defund came out, and some people are taking it quite literally, and they're saying, take all the money away, defund the police, get rid of the police. If that happens, that's not going to be a city where I live if there is not a legitimate police force. But there are certain aspects that we can look at and can reimagine, was a term Stacy used, and it's what we've been using at the local level too. What are some of the things that we know we can change? You know, the loud music complaint was used. We go into every call with the assumption that when we leave, somebody's not going to be happy with us. And we'll use the loud music call. If we go there, we tell the people to turn down the music, they're not going to be happy. If it doesn't get turned down, then the people that called us originally aren't going to be happy. But so we have to keep the peace for the night, but then what are some of the next steps that we can do? Is there some follow-up that we can do in the neighborhoods to try to get a long-standing truce between families if we have to? And is there people that can do that work for us instead of officers? So we're going to be looking at some of that stuff. One of the models that I intend on using, we have a system called B Branch Healthy Homes in our community, and as the base foundation is, we will get you money to get your house out of the floodplain and get it fixed and proper living. But part of that is that you meet with a social worker, for lack of better terms, from the VNA, the Visiting Nurse Association, to walk you through the other things. What are the health concerns in your house? What are the education concerns? What are the employment concerns? So it's taken a holistic view. Let's fix the entire household and not just a physical house. So as we look at policing, and our officers will be encountering people on a regular basis, and there's underlying problems that are very obvious. And for tonight, we're going to get the music turned down. But tomorrow, I'm going to have somebody that's going to come up and talk to you. And what can we do to end this problem permanently? But what can we do to make your life better so we don't have, you know, these little things flaring up in the community? So reallocating funding, rethinking funding, where things are going are great. The one thing I will throw out is that we've been hearing all along, don't send the police, send the social workers. I haven't found a lot of social workers that are ready to jump in and go to some of these calls right away. A lot of the social workers that I've talked to have said, who do they think are going to go to these calls at 3 a.m. with the drunken people beating the snot out of each other? There's still going to be the cops that are going to get called. Maybe tomorrow the social workers can come in and take care of it. But a lot of the social workers that I talk to say, I'd rather deal with the children, the families, the teachers, the students in my world, and I don't want to cross into your world. So that's a piece that we have to figure out too.
Kind of following up with that question, there's been a number of questions that, following up with those, thank you for those insights. A number of questions in regarding this is that, how are there ways, how can we help the police in training to change their actions? So as much as we need to maybe train social workers to interact differently, I think there's a number of questions that would like to get a little insight from the panel as to what are departments doing to improve race relations within their police forces. How are they training officers to handle this in different ways as we speak about funding and training and community relations?
Well, I guess I'll go first on that one. A lot of what you have to look at is what is the curriculum that they're being taught at the earliest stages? What does the academy instill in them? And for the most part, I can speak about the Iowa Academy, but in general, the academies teach that life and death situation, everybody's out to get you type mentality. And we have to transition that to more of you're here to be a public servant. So at the individual level, departments can work on that. We've had intercultural competence training for 16 years in our city organization. Every city employee has to go through it. But within the police, we also have core communications that every officer has to go through. We've just taken on emotional intelligence. We are one of the lead agencies. According to the practitioners that trained our staff, we are like the first law enforcement agency in the country to really take this on and get it to all levels of the department. But and part of it is we can't just assume that we know what we are doing and that what we are doing is right. We have to rely on our community partners. So that's use of groups like my Chiefs Forum and working with our local partners on some of these projects. They're going to point out the things that they think we need too. So active listening with your partners is a priority on this too.
Thank you, Chief. I know so Chief. Oh, yeah.
I have a response as well.
No, okay. Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, some of the intercultural competency curriculum and so on, whereas it can be good, you don't always get buy-in. And there's been a lot of work done in ethnographic encounters with police and police interviewing that officers can really phone that in and perform it, you know, to get through the training and then discard it. And actually that can become a badge of honor in a police subculture. So you have to be really careful. And so one of the things that I think you do is you hand the curriculum over to the critics, the community critics that you have. You literally make every single person in your police department spend a significant amount of time with the curriculum led by the leaders in the community who have free reign to take the course in the direction that they want to go with. And I've seen this work in Slovenia. I did an evaluation of a program in Slovenia. The marginalized, problematic, I put in quotes, community are gypsies or Roma. And the Slovenian National Police did this. They got the Roma leaders and they said, these officers and every single officer in our force, you know, over the course of several years, we'll sit down with you for 2 weeks and you run the show. You can teach them your language. In our case, we don't have a language difference. They do in that case. You can teach us your traditions. You can talk about what it feels like to be the community. You can tell your life stories. You can make them read books. You can do whatever you want. And you know, it seems a little loose and random, but wow, it was the most amazing thing I had ever witnessed from a policy point of view, because there were all these unanticipated positive connections because of the, and you do this all at the local level, because the police officers and the leaders running the curriculum from their point of view got to know each other so well over that week or two. You had immense amount of, later on when we did follow-up studies, crime prevention, because when stuff was going down in the community, people already knew each other from these training contexts, and they actually worked together to solve violence problems in the community, and we're no longer in a sort of internal enemy, you know, police public relations nightmare. So the training has to just be handed over to the critics. It can be done responsibly, and it's going to be huge. I want African-American leaders to be teaching our police things. And you can also turn the tables and you can have, you know, a reciprocal type of training as well, that where leaders can hear from police. But you have to be willing to bust open that curriculum, because canned intercultural competencies are really, really easy for officers to fake, and they do all the time.
Thank you, Stacy.
Camie?
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. I just have this quote that I like. It's from a former FBI director, and it says, "One reason we cannot forget our law enforcement legacy is that the people we serve and protect can't forget it either. So we must talk about our history. It's a hard truth that lives on." And I just like that. I think it's important that we, and maybe in Dubuque you're already doing this, but that the history is taught in a way, and like what Stacy said, it doesn't mean it will always be meaningful, but at least an attempt at teaching the history of policing, and especially with regard to African Americans, but also just to start that education much younger, you know, for kids who are younger, and make that a more meaningful part of school curriculums is important.
Absolutely, thank you.
Let me, yeah, I was about to say the same thing. Because, the police part of society, they didn't drop out the moon. So therefore, we have to think about ways that we change society, and we do it through education, and we have to start that education. I would argue when people are young, okay, you come into the university and you have to take a class in race and gender. Well, what percentage of people are we really catching? 25%? What about the other 75% of people that we are not catching? So we have to start to think about ways that, how do we change America as a culture? How do we change us as a country and move in the right direction?
Thank you, Roz. I know that Chief Dalsing is going to have to duck out. He has another commitment at 7:30, so I do want to extend a huge thank you, Chief, for your participation. We still have time for questions. I don't want to put a damper on the rest of the discussion. I do want to give Daniel Roman a chance to answer some of the questions. He's also part of our Criminal Justice Forensic Investigation Department, but also had a long career in the Madison Police Department. So, Daniel, I know that you wanted to help us kind of facilitate these conversations. So, feel free. I think you're muted. There you go.
Thank you. A couple of things. I'm an oddity. Graduated from Harvard in 1977 and eventually ended up on the Madison Police Force by 1984 under Chief David Cooper, who is also has been faculty at UW-Platteville. I spent 33 and a half years there as an investigator, a police officer, coming up through the ranks. The big things that I recall is in 1984, our academy had over 800 hours of academy time, and the state curriculums established by the Training and Standards Bureau was 520 hours. We continue to exceed the state mandated hours, which have now been bumped up to 720 hours. But Madison PD still continues to go well beyond that. Under Chief Cooper, we were able to shift away from a police force made almost exclusively of white males, 5'7" or taller. And the only requirement in terms of education was a high school diploma. Today, over 35% of the force is made up of female officers. Many of my classmates were all either master's degrees in social work. Some have been lawyers, some have been doctors. People have come in from different historical, academic, intellectual backgrounds and still make up the core of the police force today. That, I think, is what Chief Dalsing is pointing out, is that we have to continue to educate our officers. And as Rosalyn mentioned, being on the Police and Fire Commission, she doesn't want to hire people with just a 2-year degree. She wants people that have life experience, that have an intellectual experience, that have the ability to grow and change the police department they're working for, and to constantly shift away from the very entrenched policing systems that we've had to deal with. I just want to caution people that in 30 years, things have changed slowly, and we still have to root out that core of bias, that core of racism, that core of ignorance that persists in so many agencies around the country. And that is the goal. I mean, I emphasize that in my own classes, that we cannot stay in that prehistoric condition. So whatever we can do to change society also means increasing the education of our society. It means supporting those officers that want to work in the community. We've had community policing in Madison since the 1980s. We've had liaison officers working with the universities for noise complaints. The liaison officer goes and talks to the fraternities, the sororities, or wherever the problem is, so that officers don't have to keep wasting time on noise complaints. The last thing I wanted to address was domestic violence. Domestic violence, who are we going to send? When it gets to that point of domestic violence, a social worker as a backup is going to be great to bring that person into the system. And we do that through contacting the folks that the Madison Police already is working with in those areas, the different groups against domestic violence. But to think that we can send a social worker at 3 o'clock in the morning to deal with a domestic violence situation, which statistically happens to be one of the types of calls with the highest fatality rates for police officers, is absolutely absurd. We have to go in and deal with the situation, but we also don't leave it at that. Before the domestic violence laws were changed in Wisconsin, we would tell one of the two parties involved, go sleep it off at your brother's house, your sister's house, or go somewhere else. And I remember in my own career going to a number of calls where that's what happened. There weren't any recourses for arrest. And then later on, the partner eventually came back and killed the spouse. And that was over a matter of a couple of years because it just kept repeating itself. So, there are entrenched issues that police officers are dealing with, and we have to do it with academia. We have to have people that are looking at statistics and numbers and information out there and working together with law enforcement agencies so that we get better at what we're doing. And it is hard. And my last comment, and then I'll shut up. In reflection after my retirement, I realized that I would every day put on my pants, my shirt, my boots, grab my gun belt, and then take my gun out of the safe, put it in my holster. And in my mind and in my deepest part of my soul, I kept saying to myself, let it not be today. Let it not be today that I have to take someone's life or that someone takes mine. And so you have to remember that officers are human people. Don't forget that part of it. It is a daily struggle when we are authorized to have that power, so to speak, but it is frightening. It is frightening to carry that load. So I'll keep on, folks. Doing my part at this end. I just hope that all of you do the same to help us create a better police department around the country. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. Camie?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. It's it's great to hear about your experiences, and also definitely agree that the job of being a police officer is such a difficult job. But the one thing I just want to make sure the students that are listening, I don't know too many people that are saying that a social worker alone is going in somewhere 3 a.m. in a dangerous call. I think the idea that I've heard more frequently is that a social worker would work alongside a police officer, maybe more frequently depending on the call. And so just because I heard that both from you and our chief, I just want to make sure students don't think that that's a really common idea that we should send social workers alone to dangerous calls.
No, not at all. I've worked with many social workers over the cases that I've been involved in, doing follow-up work with them, but we certainly wouldn't advocate that. It's just putting people in danger.
Right, and I guess I'm just saying, I don't think a lot of people are advocating that particular part of it.
I do want to present this question because this came up from a number of presenters. So we do have, and I think this speaks a little bit to a very local issue as well. We have the question that schools where at least half of the students are non-white or more significantly likely to have law enforcement within the school system. Can the panelists speak to the relationship between a school resource officer, police community, and ultimately students of color? So we're, I think, to frame it, we're talking about, training police and reallocating resources for police. And I know that we have schools that are reaching out and saying we need law enforcement in the school in the form of what they call a school resource officer. How does that fit into this conversation about policing and relations in society within the United States?
Well, I think in the last forum, Dr. Haslauer touched on this quite a bit, or at least led up to it and suggested that there was a problem. For me, it is a problem to have an armed uniformed officer in schools, particularly schools with younger children, because we do know we have a school to prison pipeline. And we do know that early disciplinary singling out of students of color can start people down a pathway of being controlled by authorities. And we don't want to get an early start on that by sort of setting up a situation by which the state in the form of police officers actually observing young children. Now, that's not to say that schools don't need some of the function of discipline and safety and security. I think that is a function that's needed in a school. I would be reluctant. I mean, I'm not for the uniformed school police officer in most situations. I just think it's actually putting eyes on kids too early from the state and potentially opening them up to really early interactions that isn't going to serve them down the line. They get labeled early, and I think this can affect young people's hearts and minds. So I think it's really a question of what are we giving to our schools? What kinds of resources do we have for our schools in terms of guidance counselors, different kinds of folks that might be there to work with disciplinary issues? I would beef that arm of a school up. You can always call police in an emergency. It's not that police don't respond to schools. In fact, they respond very well. Even here in Platteville, we had a couple incidents where there were armed and dangerous people in the community due to domestic violence, and the police did a great job without a school resource officer of securing those schools until the person could be accounted for that was potential danger. And so nothing bad occurred at all. So I really don't think it's a good idea in most cases. So I would be against the school resource officer.
Thank you.
I think that would be more of a job. We talk about a social worker. Here is where that would be more of a job of a social worker. I know that when I was in New Orleans, you had one social worker for every 3 schools. So that means that they were at one school 2 days a week, then 2 days a week, then 1 day a week, and then the other 1 day a week. Well, that's ridiculous. And so when we talk about maybe assigning some funds, here would be a way that you could reassign some funds. Every school should have at least one social worker, I would say.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think that kind of covers the questions that we've had. I will check with Travis to make sure it's okay, but I'd like to be able to get the questions. I've copied them. I've copied them off onto a separate file, and we'll be more than happy to send them to the panelists. I do want to give a huge shout out. Thank you to all of our presenters, and as well as the folks that participated and contribute. Daniel, thank you very much. I do want to give a plug for our next forum in the series. It's the last one, I believe. Where do we go from here? Affecting societal change. It'll be November 6th at 6 p.m. And the Zoom registration form can be found here. And I'm sure a lot of these questions and the participation from those folks who came tonight will be greatly appreciated. So thank you all very much. It was wonderful to get a chance to see everybody and hear the panelists and hear the questions. And look forward to seeing you all on November 6th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, y'all.